Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's insightful webinar hosted by MSCCB, where we explore how to master audit preparation for integrated ISO IC 27001 and ISO 22301 certification. My name is Valona Sülay, and I am the marketing specialist at MSCCB, and I'm delighted to be your host for this session. Let me inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on MSCCB website for those who are unable to join us live. And there will also be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please make sure to submit your questions in the Q&A chat box below. Another note, attendees who participate in at least 80% of the webinar will receive a certificate of attendance that is worth 1 CPD, which means continuing professional development credits. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the topic. To explore this further, I would like to invite our speaker, Rinsky Geerlings. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Valona. And nice to meet everyone out there. I know you guys are from all over the world, so I look forward to sharing some thoughts on auditing and being audited in this session. I have prepared some slides. I'm going to share them. Valona, would you be able to give me permission and I will show them?
Can you try it now? Sorry about that.
No problem. All right. I'm assuming that's coming through. You can see that, Valona, as well?
Yes, we can.
Great, fantastic.
Thank you.
No worries. So yeah, this topic today, mastering audit preparation for integrated ISO 27001 and ISO 22301 certification. So interestingly, quite a few of you may be coming from the auditee perspective, and some others may be coming from the auditor perspective. So I will be covering both challenges, both angles, and both opportunities in this webinar. Just a little bit of background and also the agenda. I mean, the agenda is really about looking at the mastering of a audit preparation process, especially for organizations if they want to be certified in ISO 22301 for business continuity and in 27001 for information security. And the idea is to achieve a smooth and successful certification journey. Now, that sounds like a bit like a utopia to some people, but we will see in this webinar that there's quite a lot of smarts that you can build into the process that will take some of the potential challenges and pains away. And the idea is also to strengthen the information security and business continuity management systems, and how auditing, certification, and all the preparations for that, how they can actually help you with that. So like I said, we'll look at this in an integrated kind of way. We'll look at it from different perspectives. And after I share some thoughts, there'll be a Q&A session at the end. Now, if there's a real burning question where you think, I do not understand what she's saying, she's speaking double Dutch. I'm originally from the Netherlands. So if there's something that is not making sense or whatever, please do put it in the chat. I will try to look, and also Valona will also try to help with that and to look at some burning questions that may be relevant throughout the webinar. But if not, if it's something that is a little bit more broad or something more something that really initiates more discussion, then please leave it until the end. Please write your questions down whilst we're going through the presentation part. And at the end, I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. There also can be a LinkedIn discussion following this if you like. It depends, you know, you're also most welcome to tap into that format. The MSCCB have a nice LinkedIn presence, so we can also continue our conversations in there after the webinar. So all right, let's look a little bit at my background and why I'm here for this particular topic at this end of the table, of the virtual table. As you can see here, I've been doing quite a lot of work with the ISO standards, but I actually came more from an angle of the practical implementation. So I was a business continuity and disaster recovery manager, coordinator for, well, basically in the financial sector and also in IT management consultancy roles in the past. And so from doing all the practical work, I noticed quite a lot of focus whilst I was in a practitioner role focus on auditing and being audited especially. So I've been in the being audited role for years, actually decades, before I started becoming an auditor myself. And I'm not just an auditor, I also implement processes and I do training and I deliver a lot of, especially at the board level, a lot of top-down risk appetite kind of workshops and things like that these days. And maybe that's showing my age. At this point, I'm more confident in that sort of work than 20, 30 years ago, of course. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that so that it's not just coming from me as a theoretical presentation about auditing, but actually I've been in the shoes of people being audited as well. And some of the challenges that you might recognize, I've probably been in your shoes before. So if you have any of those to share, please fire away and put them also in the chat. Now, you can see in there the ISO 22301 and also the 27001 standards, but also I've done quite a lot of work with organizational resilience, so the ISO 22316 and also crisis management, the ISO 22361 standards, and the ISO 31000, which is underpinning a lot of the other ISO frameworks and standards. Not all standards are certifiable, of course, but the ISO 22301 and the 27001 are certainly certifiable. So that's why quite a lot of organizations are looking at the most efficient way to implement them hand in hand, or at least get some of those building blocks done hand in hand in a parallel sort of process. And that's what I'll share in this webinar as well, how you can achieve some efficiencies while doing it. And especially for those who have to become ready, the preparations for being certified, but also from an auditor perspective. How can you actually see what the efficiencies might be that your auditees could implement and maybe request them during the audit, because some of them are around documentation, etc. And I'll share that in this webinar. You can see here, I've worked in pretty much all continents, as you can see, but I originally am from the Netherlands, as I mentioned, so I've got the European background. 25 years ago, I moved to Australia, though, so I've worked in the capacity of living in Australia for all that period. But from there, especially from business continuity, and doing that practical BCM work, I actually got quite quickly into the Asia, Southeast Asia market, and also Africa and Latin America. So I've been doing the work there, sometimes with translators. That can be a challenge. The first time I was doing some work in Latin America, I remember I had, let's say, just like we have here, I had, I don't know, 15 or 20 slides, and I didn't realize everything would take twice as long because of the translation part. So keep that in mind. That's probably a first little warning point. If you are in a position where you are actually a multinational with lots of different languages, sometimes that can come into audits as well, where you're being reviewed, you have to be interviewed, you have to show documentation, and actually finding where's the common language, and are some papers, for example, done in a different language by an overseas office. I've had to deal with some of those challenges myself as well. So that can actually add some time and effort to the whole process. So other items you see in there, some of the awards that I've been granted, which is fantastic, especially the Delft University, my old university. I go back to the Netherlands every year to share thoughts on risk management, BCM, and information security every year in the European summer. So that's also one of the mechanisms I use to stay in tune with good practice, with what's happening out there, instead of theorizing all this work around these standards. And you can see there, Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. In Australia and also in many other parts of the world, the financial sector was the first to actually become very serious about compliant processes around business continuity and disaster recovery and information security. And there's a lot of local nationwide standards that you might find in your countries as well, where that actually was the first drive. But guess what? It wasn't just staying with the banks and with the government entities that audit the banks, but also the third-party vendors, the suppliers, the third-party providers to those regulated entities, that they actually now have to show also that they have a compliant process. So we actually find that it's not just those hard and fast regulated sectors that are coming to to you as an auditor, or if you're in that kind of sector as an auditee, you might find that there's a lot of focus in your organization on these processes. But have a think about the third-party vendors too. And there's so many of those, any of them that play a critical, time-critical role for your organization. They actually may be considering or should be considering being certified in ISO standards as well, because it's a quicker way for them to prove to you as a client, as an organization that uses their service. It might be a much quicker way for them to prove that they're worth dealing with and that they've got good processes in place. So we've seen the ISO standards going places in that context. All right, you can see here a couple of clients, well, some sectors and some client organizations that I've worked with my team. I started in 2006, a company called Business as Usual, and we've been doing consultancy, training, as well as auditing on these frameworks, especially around risk management, enterprise risk, business continuity, and information security. And I've seen quite a lot of common issues between all the organizations that I've worked with about auditing. And that's what I'm trying to pull together in this webinar in terms of best practices and what you probably want to try and avoid in terms of frustrations. So the first question to get you guys all warmed up for thinking about some practical questions. The first question I'd like to ask all of you, have a think about a moment when you were being audited or when you were an auditor, because I know two camps are in the room here, in the virtual room here today. And please write in the chat spontaneously, just as a funny opening session, put your most frustrating moment or your biggest frustration when being audited or as an auditor. Please fire away and keep them coming during my presentation. Hopefully you can put some of those there, because that's what it really comes down to, that these kind of webinars, what MSCCB is doing, you know, to actually cover some of those frustrations and make life a little easier. So if you've got some thoughts, put your biggest frustrations. This is your opportunity to be dumping all the horrible things somewhere. Oh, I can see some coming through. I can see here the client not being ready, the management system was not integrated. And I'm assuming if you're an auditor and you have that kind of comment, that you have the frustration that you cannot find all those documents that are supposed to be there, that the client, the auditee, is actually saying, yeah, we've done this work. It is somewhere. You know, it's in a document, maybe in an overseas kind of document management system that is managed by a different CISO, a different information security officer or BCM manager, and that you as an auditor spend half the audit trying to find the information. It's not even reviewing it yet because you can't get there. You don't even know where to start. A couple of other thoughts here I can see. Client not finding the documents. Yeah, the client actually having trouble finding it. The challenge to extract information when management are not ready, business not being ready, or maybe too busy with other things, trying to avoid you. I'll share with you a really horrible little story. The first role I had as an IT disaster recovery manager, I had a manager there in that organization, and the first words that she said about auditors was, please only give them the bare minimum. That was her mission to me, her instruction to me as a practitioner in that organization, to basically do not cooperate with the auditors beyond the bare minimum. So that's what I was trained by. So I had to reverse some of that training, because clearly that's not productive for the auditor, nor for you as a practitioner, to not have a proper relationship with the auditor. And so things have turned around a little bit, especially for me, but for many organizations, it's becoming better practice to have a good speaking terms with an auditor, and don't see everything too black and white, and to see things on the way instead of in the way, what the auditors are doing. Couple of other things I can see in the chat here. Repetitive questions as opposed to using evidence-based. I actually remember being in one meeting where an internal auditor asked me to assist as an external consultant. He asked me to assist with an audit that he was doing internally on their information security management system. And I had to pay attention to anything that was not consistent. And so we saw in some of the meetings that documents were not ready. We asked for the documents, and within 6 hours, we suddenly were sent all sorts of documents. And we're like, how is it possible that this was produced in 6 hours' time? Wouldn't this take 3 months, you know? And so sometimes, if you don't have all the background information as an auditor, you might think, oh, this is just pulled out of ChatGPT. But what actually was the case in that particular audit is the auditees actually did have the information, the documentation. I think it was about previous information security testing that they had been doing. And the only thing was that they extracted it on that day that we requested the documents. They extracted it from Word, Microsoft Word backend information to PDFs. And therefore, all the documents had a date and a time of that day in the last 4 or 5 hours. So it seemed like they had pulled it quickly together. But actually, what it was is they had made it easy for us to navigate and to store and to make the documents less with less volume by making them PDFs. So the auditee had done nothing wrong, but if you're not looking behind the obvious as an auditor, you might actually think, oh, they're trying to wing the process. They've just produced something quickly. So sometimes you have to be a little bit careful, you know, and also, like I said, keep that conversation going with the auditors and between the auditors and the auditees to prevent some of those misinterpretations. All right. Yeah, we see here also a point that I will cover as well is when audited, auditors sometimes are not trained well and have little experience. So they ask really weird questions, or they dig into rabbit holes that you think as an auditor, as an auditee, you think, why are they picking on this? You know, like this is not even a high risk kind of aspect. This control is actually really not important compared to some of the other ones that they're not asking anything about. You know, and that comes with skill, of course, of the auditor and knowing that industry, knowing what the organization is doing, understanding relative levels of risk, you know, between all the different business aspects of the auditee, but also some of the processes that they have and systems they use. So yeah, this all sounds very, very realistic to me. So thank you, and keep them coming, those comments. It's really recognizable, everything I'm reading here. So we'll come back to some of those also in the Q&A, I think. I'll read some of those comments there as well. And so you can see here content comparison between those two standards, especially the comment in the chat about, oh, there's no integration, there's documents between this audit, this ISO standard and that one, and it's all in separate places, managed by different people. And as an auditor, I can't find the information. Well, let's first then look at that content comparison. So everyone maybe, or maybe not everyone in this room here, but has dealt hopefully with the latest version of these two standards. If you're dealing with the business continuity standard, it should be the 2019 edition, and it should be the 2022 edition of the ISO 27001. So that's already been quite a challenge, actually, because in my view, and where I'm based in the world, in Australia, it's actually quite common for organizations to look at 27001 certification, but a bit less common to look into 22301 certification. They may be adopting the standards, it's a very popular standard, but certification tends to be more leaning towards that information security field, so the 27001. And so these two standards, if an organization has already adopted them and they're working towards those principles, at least you know what you should be looking for. There's a set of clauses, there's some controls, and that's of course the structure of those two standards. Now let's have a look at the detail behind that when you start implementing those frameworks. Most of you have heard about the plan, do, check, act kind of process. So that quality management philosophy, you can almost call it, you know, the Deming cycle, the PDCA cycle. Now, what do we see? Surprise, surprise. The BCMS as well as the ISMS, both can be tackled in very much those similar kind of structures in the same sort of steps, at least the high level processes there. So the plan, do, check, act level, you can see that is very similar in the ISMS. We're talking about defining and establishing. Then we implement and operate. Then we monitor and review, and then we maintain and improve. pretty much the same structure as the Plan, Do, Check, Act that we see referred to in the ISO 22301 standard, the BCMS. Now, if an organization has adopted both of these frameworks and they've implemented both standards, well, what can that look like in terms of the commonality? Look at these next highlighted items. In the plan column, you can see highlighted there in light red, you can see highlighted all the items that are at the top as well as at the bottom. So in the BCMS as well as in the ISMS. You can see in the first step there, the organization and its context. We see that the same way in the ISMS. It's slightly after the first step, but it's also tackled in there, in that first column, understanding the organization and its context. Then we have scoping, we have leadership and commitment. We have policy writing, so the business continuity policy and also a security policy. Looking at risks, so risks, opportunities, etc. In the top section, you can see risk management there at the bottom section. And so if you start thinking about how can we most optimally address the actual preparation for audits, have a think about how you can get the right people in the room within your organization to tackle these kind of aspects. If you've got, for example, in that planning phase, if you need senior leadership in there, maybe even the board or at least the C-suite, the executive, are you going to really do a workshop on the BCMS scope and then a workshop on the BC policy and a workshop on the risks in the context of the BCMS, and then a whole heap of workshops for the ISMS, like the scoping and the leadership and the policy and the risk management? That doesn't sound too efficient, right? So the first thing I can already advise you when you're preparing for these kind of standards to be audited and reviewed, make sure you don't wear out your own internal staff, your management, people who need to set the scene for some of these steps. Because I typically see people doing this, like the C-suite, the executive, getting together because they're really nervous about some compliance issue. It's really about ticking boxes. Oh, we need to get through these audits. So it comes from a fear base. They might get together for the workshops. You might be pulling that off. But the problem is, are they doing it because they love it? Or are they doing it because they fear not passing the audit? And that's two different things. If the first thing can be achieved, they do this because they love it, because they see there's some carrots, not just the stick. They see that they're going to get some benefits out of these processes for their business. They see how it's being facilitated, that both of these actually serve the key strategic objectives of the organization. And that's how I often start conversations with leadership, especially for that first column, because that's a lot of this is leadership talk. You need to engage that senior executive. Now, are they really going to warm up for you with your doomsday thinking about, business continuity events and disasters and, hiccups and disruptions, or the data breaches, the cyber attacks? They might, because they know they have to, but are they going to keep doing it because they love the idea of this actually helping their organization? And so I often start from what is one of the strategic objectives of the organization, and let those executives write that down on a sticky note or whatever, and then say which 3 bullet points, which 3 things could derail that objective, which 3 things could actually bring that whole strategic objective of the business down. And they might write things down like, oh, maybe we don't have enough staff, or maybe we can't get budget, or maybe there's a security breach and we don't have the reputation is now going downhill, Maybe our customers are running away because there's been a data breach and they don't trust the brand anymore. If that's those bullet points that they're writing down, that's when you start the conversation about business continuity, about ISMS, the information security risks, because now they actually then see how it links with achieving the key objectives of the organization. If you start from the risk-based kind of context, my experience is most leadership teams, and especially the board, they really don't like the idea of that conversation. They would like the idea to, well, how do we progress as an organization? How do we achieve our vision? And risk and security is all in the bucket of, oh, maybe the too hard basket a little bit. And so if they can take a holiday on the day of the audit or the review or the workshop, maybe they will. And that's what you don't want. Yeah, you want to make sure you start from scratch, really saying, if we have that leadership in the room, make sure they really understand we're not doing this to tick boxes. We do this because it serves the strategic objectives of our organization. And some of these controls that we're implementing are helping the organization to not overpromise and to actually achieve those wonderful promises they're making out to customers, to vendors, to the community, to regulators. They can actually achieve it. It has a foundation underneath where it actually becomes achievable. So that's the kind of things to think about first up. Now we have, of course, some other stages in here. When it comes to the final two columns, you see a lot of commonality between the ISO 22301, the BCMS, and the bottom section there, which is the ISMS, ISO 27001. So checking or monitoring and reviewing, it has the same sub-steps. So monitoring, measurement, analysis, evaluation, internal audit, management review, and then the final acting part. So changing the process if needed. That is about treatment of non-conformities and continual improvement. It's all the same between those two different standards. So you can see how in terms of the activities, you can combine quite easily some of them and to be efficient with the people in your organization. And that's especially for those getting ready for audits if you're in an organization that will be seeking certification in the future. All right, the next slide is really showing an example of how that works in practice. I mentioned in these previous slides, we saw things like the organization and its context. 1.1 on the BCMS or 1.2 in the ISMS. Yeah, you can see that, the organization and its context. Now, what does that mean in practice? Some environmental analysis. And guess what? Some of these slides that come from the PCB and other frameworks, you can see in there that actually it's very, very similar. You're talking about the external environment being micro or macro environment. You're talking about political, economical, social, and technological aspects. You're talking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So both the ISO 22301 and the ISO 27001, both of those frameworks actually have a very similar starting point, and that is, where are we actually in the world as an organization? What is our internal context, our external context? Yeah, those are the kind of things to keep in mind. And so the people in the room for the first standard up there and the people in the room for the second part, you can imagine it's very similar people that you're tapping into. You might have your head of sales there. You might have your head of technology there, your chief operating officer, you know, those and the CISO. Those people are required for both those standards, both those frameworks to be actually nutted out. So yeah, I hope you can see the text a little bit. I see a comment here from someone. These slides will be shared in PDF format as well, so hopefully that will help you. The slide is really just to illustrate that for both those frameworks, some of the activities are very, very similar. And what does that come down to? It's not actually a surprise, is it? Because both the BCMS, the Business Continuity Management System, and the Information Security Management System, both actually aim to protect the crown jewels. Now, the crown jewels is maybe not a common term in every organization, but basically the most important, the most sensitive, the most high value information, assets, processes, even people in the organization. And so business continuity management focuses on, if there's a disruption, which of those crown jewels do we get, well, do we recover and or do we reinitiate somehow? For example, if one of my real strategic processes is research and development, producing really high level medical research results, for example, those crown jewels in that organization are, well, the documentation, maybe the laboratory results, anything that's been saved in that regard for that research. And so you find your business continuity management system, your process, is actually trying to make sure it can be recovered, it's saved somewhere else maybe, or the documentation around it has been saved so it can be restored in case of a disruptive incident. The ISMS is looking at how can the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of this information, how can it be safeguarded? And the A in that CIA triad, in that CIA triangle, some people call it, the A about availability actually touches straight onto BCMS, the Business Continuity Management System. Whilst C and I, if we talk about the CIA, confidentiality and integrity are real core activities within the ISMS. We don't see that being tackled by the BCMS. But you can see the CI and A are actually sitting between the two. And so, yeah, they're both frameworks are actually trying to protect those crown jewels. Hopefully that makes sense. It's very much similar type of thinking that you need for both. So if you pull together an executive team to talk about these issues, to ask them what are those most sensitive, critical, high value activities or assets of the organization, for both the BCMS and the ISMS, you probably get similar answers to start working with. So there's no point in organizing a whole separate workshop for one of those frameworks and another one for the other one, because you actually have the same similar people in the room and they will start feeling workshopped out and worn out from all these conversations and workshops and all the discussions and interviews if you don't do it efficiently. Hopefully that makes sense. And maybe there's another frustration you can share in that regard in the chat, you know, about managers, team leaders, business management, operations managers, anyone you're trying to involve in these processes, some frustrations about them getting annoyed, you know, not wanting to be part of this anymore because it's taking too much time away from their day-to-day operational work. And you can understand that. It's not surprising. So yeah, let's have a look at some of the other aspects. Opportunities for efficiency and alignment are also in the context of risk-based approach. Both the BCMS and the ISMS have a very strong focus on looking at risks. Now, a little bit different is the context for it, but very similar is the background and the thinking and the principles. I mentioned the ISO 31000 as well, right? So actually both the ISO 22301 and the 27001 both have the thinking process as we have in the risk management standard or the guidelines, which is the ISO 31000. And they use very similar principles. So in terms of the BCM, what we're looking at there, the requirements there, which are covered in those clauses that you can see, the organization shall identify the risks of disruption to the organization's prioritized activities and to the required resources or assets, analyze and evaluate the identified risks, and determine which risks require treatment or which risks require treatment first. So how do we prioritize those risks? And so the purpose is to enable the organization to assess the risks and ensure that it can take appropriate action. So that's the first section there about the BCMS. Now, very similarly, you find that risk-based thinking happening with ISO 27001. With that one, it says the organization shall define and apply an information security risk management process that enables and maintains organization's security risk criteria. It ensures that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid results, etc. Identify the security risks, analyze the information security risk, and evaluate them. So very similar language, very similar principles about, first of all, really looking at identifying the sources of risks, identifying the risks, then analyzing the likelihoods, the impacts, evaluating them, and then determining which treatments are we going to implement. And of course, you have to overlay that with what budget you have, what's the return on investment, all of that, yeah? So it's not just about the risk, it's also about what ability do you have to treat those risks. So the similar type of thinking is in both of those frameworks happening. When you're talking about treatments for business continuity risks, it might mean offsite facilities. It might mean that you have a third-party vendor that also stores some of your data. In your information security management system, in terms of the lowering risk, it might be, well, you have a great external tool that actually monitors and sniffs your systems all the time for intrusion, for example, or your communication security, your endpoint security of people working from home. Those might be the controls that you've prioritized in that process. Every business needs to weigh up the risks against the benefits. Yeah, so once again, what people in the room should determine that? Well, you're typically talking about some of the technical experts, but also some of the business managers who can say, well, actually, that particular risk we can wear as an organization. We can wear in our business unit because we've got great manual workarounds, or because actually that set of data is not as sensitive. You know, it only contains, I don't know, customers' first names and email addresses or something. Maybe it's not quite the same as all their health information and other aspects, you know, credit card details or whatever. So that risk assessment we do on data, we do it on business processes, etc. And you have the similar kind of wisdom in the room to determine it. So I already heard one of the people in the chat saying, oh, it can be frustrated if the auditor, they don't really know our systems, they don't know our process, they don't understand our business or our priorities. They're just digging away into areas that are really not important. Well, there you go. That's actually why a technical expert on the audit team or multiple technical experts is actually a really good idea. Now, it does require a small investment, but I'm very, very much in favor of it. And the main reason for that is, first of all, not to waste auditees' time. So if you have an audit team that actually is very skilled in your field of work as a business, one example, I've got one client, for example, they work in the fintech industry. So very much high-tech financial sector, but high-tech products and services. And if I, as an auditor, don't bring a technical expert who has the latest information and the latest technical sort of information on things like the fintech latest tools and the latest inventions there, I know that the client is not going to be impressed. The auditees are not impressed because they already have to start explaining what they do all day long before we can even start the audit. And the other thing is they feel they're not getting anything back for it. So if you're an auditee, if you work in an organization and you get an audit proposal which includes a technical expert from the audit team, you might think, oh, that's a bit of an investment there. But actually, if you think about it, it's a real time saver in the end. And it also might give you a secondary benefit, and that is that you're going to learn something from that technical expert about how you benchmark against other organizations in your industry. So it actually can give you some innovative ideas. And that's what one of the benefits is that I've seen with another organization I'm doing some audits for, is they really like that technical expertise on my team. And I can be a great auditor, but do I know from all sectors the latest and the greatest technology information? Possibly not. I can grab the ISO 22301 and I can grab the ISO 27001 and I can look for all those controls in detail, but where they fit in the organization and how they support that organization is very much linked to their industry, their particular geographical area, perhaps, especially with 22301, you know, when we're talking about environmental risks and things like that on the BCMS. It's nice that you've got, for example, a local audit team member as well who knows that particular geographical area and the environmental risks that are prevalent there. So if you see that as a cost factor in the audit proposal, it might actually be a fairly wise investment. Now, if you have a very low tech kind of organization that doesn't have any of those technical kind of specialized areas, you might rethink it. But my experience is that most organizations benefit from this. Then next, let's have a look at another example, that is awareness programs. Let's again look at the BCMS, the ISO 22301, as well as the ISO 27001. Well, in ISO 22301, we see that an awareness program really allows organizations to raise awareness about the impact of disruptions and the necessary steps to prepare for, respond to, and recover from these disruptions, amongst other things. It also ensures consistency in business continuity practices and contributes to the dissemination and implementation of business continuity policies, guidelines, and procedures. And an employee who's neither aware nor trained actually is a potential risk. So awareness programs we need in the context of business continuity. And if the printing is small, I'm reading them out, those slides, so that those guys who can't read it on a smaller screen, this is the context of what we're seeing with business continuity management. Awareness programs for ISO 27001, you're talking about allowing the organization to raise awareness regarding information security threats and how to protect from potential risks, and also consistency in information security practices and contributing to dissemination and implementation of policies, guidelines, and procedures, very similar to the previous section at the top there. So don't you think that there can be some combinations happening where you have awareness programs for business continuity management about business disruptions of all sorts of nature? It could be environmental risk, protest, other threats. It could be related to transport outages. But maybe one of those risks or those areas of risks in there is also if the IT systems or your hard copy information are actually under threat from some sort of intrusion. So it could be a cyber attack, data leak, data breach. That's one area of risk, which is managed in the ISO 27001, but it actually is also part of the scope of your business continuity risks. So it's like a subset. I often see the ISO 27001 a little bit as a subset of what you can do to treat business continuity risks. And not just on the impact side, which is what business continuity is all about, but also on the preventative side. And that's why the 27001 is actually touching on much, much broader information security risks than we can usually link into our BCM. Because in BCM, just like BIA, we're talking business impact analysis, we talk mainly on the impact side. Whereas what you see in 27001, many of the annex controls are also looking at preventative, looking at, for example, intrusion detection. It's looking at lowering the risk of poor user management, hiring and firing of employees, and how that creates security risk if it doesn't get handled properly. So those sorts of things are in that particular context there. So when you see the opportunities there for alignment, hopefully it can apply quite quickly to your organizations too, where you can implement some of these initiatives hand in hand, the top and the bottom there, linking to both those processes. Another area is documentation. Now, this model you may have seen before as well from the MSCCB. You can see there the ISO 27001 and the ISO 22301, just like you see with other standards, because we're not even looking at things like quality management and other, for example, information security in the supply chain, that's ISO 28000. All of them have actually very similar or exactly the same references to the different clauses in the standard. You see mild differences, but almost none. For example, continual improvement, there's a bit of a change there between the different numberings, but most of the other ones are actually the same. So that means if you make documentation for ISO 27001, and you're talking about how leadership and commitment is achieved, and you talk about similar topics in your ISO 22301, in your BCMS, is there a way that you can actually somehow combine that documentation or make it two sections of the same document, or combine them and have them kind of meta tagged, in terms of keywords for BCMS as well as ISMS? Because my experience is if you duplicate the information and tweak it for that particular framework, you might get things getting quite quickly out of date and a huge volume of documents. Now, documents don't have to be big to make sense. In fact, it should actually annoy auditors to see auditees coming with huge volumes of things, and actually the content, the real core of the content, is so hard to find because it's hidden between so many black text on white paper. And so you can see in my following slide, are your documents easily findable? You know, can you actually detect where the document lives? If you work inside an organization and you have trouble finding the latest version yourself, imagine what it's like for an auditor. The naming convention of documents, I often see people naturally giving things names, you know, like they might call it remote work. And the next information security staff member has saved that same document and it has called it teleworking. Now we're trying to look for the right version, for the right naming convention. Suddenly we're confronted with multiple documents on the work floor. And I'm saying work floor, but I'm talking in for example, in document management systems, you know, where there's multiple versions, multiple names for things, or one huge information security management document that has all the different sub procedures and policies in it. It can be okay, but as long as there's those bookmarks or meta tags very easily findable, where someone, an auditor, comes and actually can correlate it quite easily with the ISO 22301 or the ISO 27001 sections. And that can be the clauses or the actual controls. So quite a few tools are out there. You may have encountered some, especially for 27001. I've seen quite a lot of document management frameworks, toolkits, you know, that actually follow exactly the structure of the ISO 27001. So that can be very, very handy. Just be careful if a new version of the standard comes out, and how are you going to migrate that? We've seen it with the ISO 27001. You know, about 4 or 5 years ago, I had an organization, they were proudly showing how they had produced all the documentation in there. They had actually made it very intuitive to look at things because it had exactly the file names of the ISO 27001 2013 version. And or 2000, was it 2013? I think it was, yeah. And then the 22 version came out, or was it 2015? I'm now getting confused, but a long time ago. And then, you know, the 2022 version came out of the standard, and this organization had to revamp all their documents again with renaming and re-meta tagging. And for auditors, it became a bit of a hurdle to actually find everything because the structure had to slightly change. Some things had to be combined. And so migrating that with some support is not a bad idea, because it can actually become a pretty quick task if you have someone who quickly helps you with that naming convention and the migrating. And I mentioned already quantity versus quality. I have organizations that, because the auditors are coming, they produce hundreds of pages of ChatGPT style documents, and it becomes even harder for the auditor to find the real gist of it. So make sure you don't fall into that trap. There can always be supporting documents somewhere, but have the core elements easily findable, easily reviewable by auditors, and also by your own internal staff, you know, to be able to quickly find some information. Often it is the illusion that the more we produce, the better it is, but I actually am almost at the opposite side of the spectrum. And especially when it becomes to during an actual incident. So if there's a real cyber attack, do you really want a 500-page plan that covers all the variations of the different themes? When the people who respond, they need a checklist as well, something that is tick, tick, tick. Am I asking the right questions? It doesn't need the full playbook of, or the full process of how to deal with the actual threat, but at least it needs a checklist of what questions to ask. And that can prompt at least that dynamic, and the right team members in the room and their alternates. Similar things we find in business continuity. Big plans, big documents. On the day of an incident, nobody looks at it. You know, when there's a flood, fire, explosion, whatever, a bomb scare, people are running out of buildings. They haven't even thought about the plan. And that's, of course, not where you want to be. So as an auditor or as an auditee in this field, be on the lookout for that, and be proactive and be courageous by feeding back to people to say, look, I know we're writing this because the auditors are coming, but is it actually making sense? Can we prove that we will use it in the future? Or is it just one of those, you know, tick box kind of exercises? All right, a few final thoughts here before we go to Q&A. The benefits of a pre-audit. Now, I put in there before being thrown into the lions then, and that may sound a bit funny, but I've had quite a few organizations who eventually actually said, yeah, let's invest in a pre-audit. That means the actual people who will come in for the certification audit are doing a gap analysis, a pre-audit for us. They will help us identify, what actually is missing right now. At least we've now met these people. We met the auditors. We had a chat to them. They started to ask some questions about our business. They haven't helped us improve anything. Beware of that, because then it becomes a conflict of interest, right? You can't have an auditor auditing their own process. But if you have a pre-audit, is a great way to see those auditors that are coming maybe 2, 3, 4 months later, and you actually have had them involved in identifying some of the key priorities. They've already started to look at, can they actually find the information? So if there's already troubles with that, don't wait till the actual audit to fix it. You've got all that time in between the pre-audit and the audit, which is your own time frame. You can make that pretty flexible, as long as your process hasn't completely changed, because then the pre-audit becomes worthless, right? But let's assume that you're talking about 3 to 6 months or something, and you had the auditors in there to look as a pre-audit, at your processes. And then when they come back to do the certification audit, at least it doesn't feel as scary. And I'm putting those lines there, but I know how it feels for auditees. And I've been in that position myself where I thought, oh my goodness, who are we going to get in the door here? And even to also identify if there are skill gaps within the audit team, and to be able to say, hey, are you sure we don't need a technical expert on your audit team when you come in here and audit our organization? Because it's going to be a very draining process otherwise. All right. Now I'm looking forward to seeing some more of those comments. This is your time to get in there and to ask some questions. Let's see. Valona may also have
Yes.
be able to give me some help with this. Any
Sure.
burning questions from the audience that we can start with?
Yeah. Thank you once again for this incredible presentation, Rinsky, and for sharing all this valuable information on audit preparation for integrated ISO IC 27001 and ISO 22301 certification. Now let's move to the Q&A session. The first question that we picked says, how do you suggest organizations combine risk management activities to align with both standards simultaneously?
Yeah, I think it really links to what I said earlier. Let me go back to that slide. There's a section in here that I mentioned. So when you're looking at the type of risk activities in context of BCMS, the context is all about disruption risk, how to actually look at any sources of risk that could actually create a business interruption. Now, some of those, a subset of those, are related to information security risks. Would you agree? Like there can be also other reasons for business disruption. It doesn't have to be a cyber attack. It could be staff illness. It could be environmental impacts. It could be global warming, floods, fires. So the second section at the bottom there is the ISO 27001 context for risk management, and that is always about security risk, information security risk. So I would see if you do an implementation of risk management with workshops, with risk registers, etc., actually looking at a subset of those being related to information security. Yeah. So BCM might be maybe the best starting point, I would say, because you have a broader view on the types of risks, and then a subset of that being around that information security risk. Does that answer the question?
I think so, and I hope so. We also have another question, but in the chat, it says risk Africa or other parts of the world in terms of BC and ISMS. What is the impact or risk where there are wars, conflicts, and corruption? If we look at global warming, floods, and droughts.
Yeah. Well, in those regions where specific risks are more prevalent, I don't even know anymore if wars are only happening in some regions because they seem to pop up everywhere these days. But yeah, I can see where you're coming from, and the same with corruption, by the way. I think it's just how visible it is and in what way that we might think it only happens in some places. I think it might be happening much more broadly that we don't even know about, right? Or in different forms. But I get your point, and it is all, of course, it's very specific for a region where what's happening in that region. That's where risk assessment becomes so important, to say, okay, do we have a technical expert on our risk team? Not necessarily on, the audit team, but I'm talking about the actual implementation of risk management in an organization. Do we have technical experts on that team to identify what risks are there, to actually facilitate a good brainstorming session on that, to be able to tap into all the different sources of risk? Another way to do it without external expertise is, and this has worked really, really well for me in the past, and that is I call them all the bad news people. So the security managers, the disaster recovery managers, the BCM team, the risk management people, any of those people, the physical security team, maybe facilities team, anyone who thinks in the organization about the stuff that can go wrong. They typically feel a little bit lonely anyway, because they are always in the doomsday modus and nobody else wants to hear it. If those people got together on a monthly basis, for example, with a think tank, a lunchtime think tank sort of session, and to actually brainstorm about categorizing all the different types of risk. You mentioned some of those things around war and conflict and corruption, but other risks that pop up there could be things like protests, riots, and then cyber protests, because protesters these days use cyber tools as well to hassle organizations or regions. So if you had that think tank approach, internally you pull all those heads together, no matter what their seniority is. I'm talking about real practitioner level as well as manager level, doesn't matter. And actually say, what do you guys think? What's the priority? Where's the low-hanging fruit? How do we find the 80-20 rule, like the most prevalent risks that we need to deal with as our organization in this region that we're operating? That might be a really great hands-on way to keep in touch with that. Yeah. So is that
Okay.
giving you some pointers, do you think? I'm looking at who asked the question, but yeah, please put in there if that helps. Yeah,
Yeah,
internally you
we
often
have.
have quite a lot of expertise. Okay,
Okay.
process
Now,
mapping, integration. Yeah, sorry,
let's
go
have
on.
another question from the Q&A chat box. It says, if I have an integrated MS, do you think that the scope statement should and could be the same for both management systems?
Mm, doesn't necessarily have to be like that because it depends on how what you include in your certification. So you may say, for example, let's say you have a manufacturing business that is in 5 different locations in one country, and you also have 2 overseas offices. Maybe for the BCMS, the scope is global, and for your ISMS, maybe you choose only your Australia-based presence or your country-based presence, or the other way around. So you have to be honest with your scoping when you actually go for your certification. Your certificate will have a specific scope on it for that standard. And the other thing is with ISO 27001, you do a activity called the statement of applicability, where you actually look at which clauses and controls of the ISO 27001 are applicable to our organization. So, for example, if you don't do any software development, the clauses and especially the controls from the annex that relate to software development can be removed and they can actually be excluded from the scope. Now, the scope statement for your BCMS may be far broader and more generic and covering much more, more locations, but also more parts of the business. So you don't necessarily have to have that the same. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's take another one. It says, as an auditor, how can we come to an agreement of the justification that client has provided for risk versus control implemented?
Yeah, well, that comes to that technical expertise a little bit, right? Like on the one hand, you need to have a level of trust with the auditee that what they're choosing and what justification they've used is suitable for their business, for their size, for their complexity, for the region they operate in, etc. You need to have a level of trust that they also do their own risk assessment properly. But on the other hand, and which is why I'm so advocating, I'll put that slide up again, but why I'm so advocating having a technical expert on the team, because having that person there, they can actually validate that level of risk that they've assigned, that the auditee have assigned to certain risks, and that they haven't just ignored one risk because it's just too hard to put controls in place, because that's of course not acceptable, right? But if the auditee has said, well, this is actually a relatively low likelihood, low impact type event, therefore we don't put controls in place like we do with some of the other ones, with the other risks, then it makes sense, right? Risk-based approach we have to apply as auditors in pretty much all the things we do, because we can't audit every single black letter on paper about any of all of the clauses, and the controls. There's usually no time for that. We do a little bit of broad and a little bit of deep analysis, assessment of validity, but we can't check every single transaction on whatever happened in the last 12 months. We need to always be a little bit selective, and that selectiveness should not be based on, hot air. It should be based on risk, ideally, at least to a high degree. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
I also wanted to read this one. What is your suggestion when organizations have a broad data transfer, but their risk acceptance criteria is accept the potential risk, even it can be high risk for data breach or miss data or data misresponsibility? How we as an auditor can suggest the organization for miss risk mitigation? Thank you.
Yeah, similar answer to that, actually, because you have trust a little bit the organization in doing its own risk assessment properly with your guidance or with your review. As in you're observing, of course, how they've done it, and to say, did that make sense? Yeah, but what is that based on? Yes, partially your understanding of their industry as well, and maybe that benchmarking ability that you have as an auditor to know, this is pretty common in this sector, that this particular risk is actually not so prevalent. Whereas, in other sectors it might be. I mentioned healthcare, for example, where information security risk, the personally identifiable information, confidentiality around that is typically of a lot bigger concern than if you have a sector where I don't know, hamburgers are sold and you don't even know the name of the customer. There may be a big difference in terms of assessing the information security risk there. So it's sector specific, it's sometimes regional as well, and it is as in geographically oriented, but also the specific organization and what kind of information they're holding, sometimes related to the volume of information they hold, if they hold information for other organizations as an outsourced kind of service, or are they just holding information for themselves, for their own clients and staff, etc. Yeah, I think it depends on the knowledge of the auditors to say this is enough and this is really an area of concern. So yeah, it comes with expertise, with experience, of course, and that's a bit hard to make that a general guideline. But there's of course also other auditors within the MSECB, if you work under their umbrella, where you can also put those questions out in a generic sort of way, but to say, look, well, how would you see this particular level of risk assessment, or the labeling of that, and I mean the assessment of it, has the client done this correctly or not? And there may be some comments you can find from colleagues in the MSECB space if you're an auditor with them, or if you're becoming an auditor with them. That's one of the benefits. There's always a sounding board there, a whole group of people who are doing similar audits, so you can actually ask the question there. Like I said, within the NDA, the non-disclosure requirements, you can at least maybe ask that in a generic way, but get some sort of guidance on it. So hopefully that also gives you some ideas there.
Okay, let's take one last question from the webinar chat. It's from Martin, and it says, are there any established process reference models that can be used to integrate both standards into a unified framework?
Mm. And is that this is for the ISO 22301 and 27001, right?
Yeah.
Because I can
Hmm.
also great, because I also see some people referring to BIA, for example, but we're talking about these. Look, I know that in the past there were some of those crosswalks. You know, you could see it as basically as a big Excel kind of or a table or an Excel spreadsheet where you see, this is the clause reference for the BCMF, this is the ISMS, and see where you can have common kind of activities like workshops with senior leadership and those things. I know in the past I've seen them and I've shown you at least the references between them and where they live. But in terms of an actual roadmap for it, I haven't seen anything recently, no. In the past, I've worked on it myself because I think efficiency and not wasting auditees' time is important. And especially if you're still implementing the processes within an organization, you want to be really efficient because you don't see them once a year, you see them all year round. An auditor can sometimes ask the same question 3 times in different contexts because, well, either because they just are not efficient enough, but also another thing is it actually would be a validation kind of process to say, am I hearing 3 times the same answer? But the auditor can do that approach sometimes, not to the nth degree, but okay, to a certain level where it can maybe annoy the auditee a little bit, but of course it's a once a year activity. Whereas implementing a process, you do want that kind of real integrated approach. But a real roadmap for it as such, I don't think I've seen anything up to date. I think it's really about good project planning in the beginning, where you know, this is where we can combine some activities. This is, for example, also where, let's say you've got board meetings every 3 months in the calendar in that organization. Well, that means maybe you can combine the reporting on both of those progress, the progress on both standards in the next board meeting. You can combine it or put it into some sort of format and make it efficient that way. But yeah, there's no real guide for it, if you ask me, not up to date. Yeah, unfortunately. And maybe it's actually really useful to do it yourself, to come up with an approach and design the approach for that organization yourself, because there's a lot of subtle differences between organizations, of course. Yeah.
Okay,
All
thank you,
right.
Rizky, for answering all of those questions. That was all for today's session. A huge thank you to our speaker for sharing her valuable insights and expertise with us today. We appreciate your time and your thoughtful contributions. And thanks to everyone for joining in. For future updates on webinars, please follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Also, please email us at marketing@msccb.com to request the webinar certificate. Have a wonderful day ahead. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.